What convinces the world the truth of the Christian faith is our love for each other. It's like Francis Schaeffer, the famous Christian apologist, says. He says, at the end of the day, God's final apologetic to a skeptical world is the love that exists in the church.
He says, by this, all people will know you are my disciples if you have love one for another. Dr. Francis Schaeffer said, love on display in the church is Jesus's final apologetic to the world.
6 characteristics of gospel-shaped love.
So what are his 6 love directives?
Number one, Paul says our love in the church should be without hypocrisy.
Number 1, Paul says in verse 9, love genuinely.
Y'all, one of the worst Southern phrases is, bless his heart.
In the South, you will often hear people say, bless his heart.
Because that means that what I just said was really mean, but I'm going to cover it over and season it with some Southern politeness with bless his heart. He is such an idiot. Bless his heart.
You know what that really means? Because if it were in New York or New Jersey or in California or Oregon, it would be, what an idiot.
And maybe you've experienced that phony kind of love, and maybe it's really turned you off. Some of Jesus' strongest words in the Gospels were about people like this. In fact, he called them whitewashed tombs.
Maybe you've experienced this kind of fake love at church or around people who call themselves Christians. It's a turnoff, isn't it? It really is, because you think if they're fake, then God must be fake. That's the wrong conclusion. Jesus saved his harshest rebuke for fake people. They were called the Pharisees, and you know what he called them? Whitewashed tombs.
Right? Some people are hard to love.
Yes, but, Pastor, some people are difficult to love.
Well, see, that's where Romans 12:1 kicks in.
This is where God's love kicks in.
Romans 12:1, in light of the mercies of God, the gospel is going to enable you to love people in a way that nothing else can, because it teaches you that you will never have to love someone more annoying than you were to God.
The Bible says that God gives us the grace to love them. Romans 12:1, he says, I appeal to you by the mercies of God. Listen to this. God had mercy on you and me. He wants us to have mercy on others.
Recently in our family devotions, we were reading through a John Piper devotional. And John Piper tells the story, Matthew 18, of the man forgiven 10,000 talents. This really is my favorite parable, y'all, and it wrecked me again just in the middle of family devotions. The basic gist of it is this. There's a king who has a servant who owes him 10,000 talents. Sometimes the ginormous size of that debt is lost upon us because we don't think in terms of talents, but think of it this way. King Herod, who was one of the richest kings in Israel of all time, the richest man in Israel at the time of Jesus, King Herod's annual income from all the taxes he collected was 900 talents.
Jesus told a parable in Matthew chapter 18. He said there was a man who owed his master, or a king, in Matthew chapter 18, 10,000 talents. Now, you don't have a clue what that medium of money meant. I wouldn't have a clue either if I didn't study it. But 10,000 talents is equivalent. It's got a national debt ring to it. It's an equivalent to what Herod, it was more than what Herod brought in every year as king over Israel. And remember, he was placed there by the Romans, so he wasn't really Jewish, but he was a king who taxed the people heavily. But in his national annual amount of taxes, it didn't come to 10,000 talents. It was more like 900 talents.
So when you say a guy's got a debt of 10,000 talents, we are talking about a nearly incalculable debt. So the king threatens to sell this man and his family into slavery to pay the debt, which is what happened in those days. Verse 26, Matthew 18. At this, the servant fell face down before him and said, no, be patient with me, and I'll pay you everything. Then the master of that servant had compassion, released him, and forgave him the loan. That forgiveness, said John Piper, is as spectacular as the size of the debt, and that is the point. Jesus, in telling the story, wants us to realize that sin is an incalculable debt we can never pay back. Never. No amount of contrition or good works could repay the debt of dishonor we have heaped upon God through our sin.
That's amazing. So what this is telling us is that this man owed the king 10,000 talents, and he said, I can't pay it. And he said, well, I'll have to throw you in the debtor's prison. And he knew that he wouldn't be able to pay it. But the king looked at him and had mercy on him. And what did he say? He said, I forgive you the whole thing. So the guy walks out of that experience. Now, understand something. The massive amount of his debt was met by the same or greater massive amount of forgiveness.
Yet in this story, the servant in Jesus' story did not recognize the forgiveness for what it was. He did not see it as stunning, breathtaking, and undeserved. In fact, Jesus never even records the man saying a single word of thanks. Even more incredibly, when this man walks out of the courtroom, he encounters another man who owes him a single denarius, which was the one-day wage of a poor man, of a day laborer back then. This servant seizes that man, begins to choke him, and says, "Pay me what you owe." The man pleads for patience, but the servant will show none, and he throws him in prison until he can pay the debt.
He walked right out, turns to his right or to his left, I don't know which one, but he sees a guy who owed him a day's salary. He grabbed him by the neck, the scripture tells us in another place. He drug him to the debtor's prison or before the court to throw him in jail until it was paid in full.
Well, the king, the original king, hears about this and is legitimately angry. He brings the man, the servant, back in and says, "You wicked servant, I forgave you all that debt because you begged me. Shouldn't you also have had mercy on your fellow servant, just as I had mercy on you?" And because he was angry, he handed him over to the jailers until he could pay everything that was owed.
The king heard about it. The king was so upset. He said, "I had mercy on you. Why could you not have mercy on this man?"
John Piper says, the point of this parable is that God has no obligation to save a person who claims to be his disciple if they have not received the gift of forgiveness for what it really is: infinitely precious, amazing, undeserved, heart-humbling, mercy-awakening. If we claim to be forgiven by Jesus, but there is no sweetness of forgiveness or patience or love in our hearts for others, God's forgiveness is simply not there in our heart.
John Piper says, if we claim to be forgiven by Jesus, but there is no sweetness of forgiveness or patience or love in our hearts for others, God's forgiveness, look at this, is simply not there.
The whole time, though, you're repenting of your hateful, unkind heart. The whole time you're asking God to change it, and you are pressing more deeply into the mercies of God for you, and you're saying, "God, I know I should love this way. God, change me. God, overwhelm me with the beauty of the gospel so that I can love people like this."
But do this, say, "God, the feelings of unforgiveness are still inside of me. Lord, would you love this person through me? And would you help me to repent? Because I haven't fully yet forgiven."
That's where he begins. Just like Pastor Joby said a few weeks ago. Jesus can't help the fake you. Jesus didn't die for the fake you.
Jesus cannot help the fake you.
A real Jesus died on a real cross for the real you. And the only way he can help the real you is when you expose the real you to him.
He can only help the real, sinful, broken, struggling you.
Paul says, "Let your love be without hypocrisy." Number 2, our love should be grounded in God's truth. Also verse 9.
Number 2, the second directive he gives us is love truthfully. Look at verse 9 again.
I mean, think about it. Have you ever seen a parent who is too weak to discipline their children even when it's necessary?
So there are parents who just can't bring themselves to discipline a child.
And what's motivating you in that moment is not love for them, it's love for you. It's love for your own comfort. So make sure your love is grounded in God's truth, and make sure it's willing to suffer the abuse from that person, the emotional, just the invectives that are going to come when you try to tell them the truth. Jesus loved us so much that he told us the truth even when it made us so mad that we killed him for it. Paul said that's how you should love each other.
In the name of God's love, then friend, we are more interested in self-love. We're just protecting ourselves. We'd rather not have the hassle. We'd rather not lose the relationship. We'd rather not run that risk. And Jesus loved us enough to tell us the truth. And what did we do to him? We nailed him to the cross.
Number three, our love should feel like family. Paul says our love should feel like family. Look at verse 10. Love one another deeply as brothers and sisters.
So Paul gives us a third directive. The first directive, he said love genuinely. Secondly, love truthfully. Third, he said love faithfully. Look at verse 10. Love one another with brotherly affection.
Two very interesting Greek words in that verse.
Now Paul does something interesting in the Greek language. He combines two words.
Philo, storge. Philo is the word for friendship, love. Storge is the word for affection. It's like two words for love put together. It's like a love sandwich. Love, love. Paul's like, love, love. Love one another deeply. That's how we translate it. As brothers and sisters is the word Philadelphia, where we get the name of our city. It means brotherly love.
But then there's the word philo. It's where the city Philadelphia gets its name. It's brotherly love. And then he takes philo and storge, which is familial love. It's family love. It's the love of a father or mother for their child or their parent or the brother or sister. So he says there's a brotherly friendship kind of love, two guys, like the Proverbs says, that are closer than a brother. And then there's the storge, which is a familial love. You love your family because they're your family, they're your kin.
I love how C.S. Lewis describes this. He's like, love is never wasted. True love is never wasted. If it's not true love, then you feel like it's wasted. Like, I love that person, they didn't let me back. What a waste. But true love is never wasted. The kind of love you have for your kid is not wasted because its value does not rest upon reciprocity.
C.S. Lewis put it this way, and he wrote a book called Four Loves, talking about these four loves. He said, love is never wasted, for its value does not rest upon reciprocity. In other words, you don't have to get it back.
I was talking with some of our pastors this week about how do people relate to the church, and one of them said, well, it's kind of like an intramural soccer team.
Some treat church as a membership like an intramural sport.
It's a weekend activity, you enjoy it, you're invested in it a little bit, you give it some of your energy, but you know it's only one night a week.
It's something you enjoy doing, it takes some energy, but one night a week, you're done, and that's all it is.
By the way, what that means is that leaving a church and going to a new one ought to be a serious decision.
Leaving a church should be a difficult and not a casual decision for anybody.
And number four, our love should recognize the inherent worth that God has placed in every person, Paul says. I love this next part of the verse. Outdo one another in show and honor.
Here's number 4. Paul says his fourth directive is love respectfully. This is good. Look at verse 10. He says, outdo one another with showing honor.
But the basis of honor in most cultures is on your stature or your rank or your accomplishments. In old Europe, it was always based on your family pedigree. You know, what class you were. In the United States, it's supposed to be based on your accomplishments.
You see, honor in old Europe was based upon your status or pedigree or nobility. In America, honor is given to people because of their success.
The gospel teaches us that every person has great value, not because of what they accomplish, but because they are made in the image of God.
But biblically, honor is given to people because they were created by God in His image and for His glory.
Reminds me of one of my favorite C.S. Lewis quotes, where he says this: "It is a serious thing to live in a society of possible gods and goddesses. To remember that the dullest and most interesting person you talk to, who you thinking about right now? All right, think about them. May one day be a creature which, if you saw it now, you would be strongly tempted to worship."
I want you to think about the most uninteresting person you know. It may be someone with special needs. It may just be somebody you know, and their life may be dull to you. But you know, C.S. Lewis said, he said, one day in heaven you will see them, and you will be tempted to bow down and worship them as gods, because they will fulfill the glory of how God made them.
In fact, one of the most interesting ministries that the early church had, we translate it as a baby run.
They had what they called in English baby runs.
They would, so in the Roman Empire, before they had all the surgical procedures of abortion and all that kind of stuff, you didn't want your baby. A lot of them would just leave it on the doorstep. Let it die overnight as it's exposed to the elements, and then the next morning sanitation would come along and they would pick up these discarded babies and they would throw them away whether they were alive or not.
At night, people who in those days did not abort the children they didn't want. What they would do is they would put them out on the doorstep on a cold night, and they would die of exposure. Or they would leave it on someone else's doorstep, or they would take them out in the woods and leave them.
That was abortion in the early Roman Empire. Well, the Christians knew that these were babies made in the image of God, and so they started to do these things called baby runs. It was early pro-life advocacy, where they would listen for the cries, walk through the neighborhoods at night, every night, and they would see where children were left, and they would go pick them up. This was the beginning, they say, of the orphanage system.
So early Christians got in the habit late at night of walking around the cities they lived in, listening for the cries of children. And this is where the orphanage system began.
One of the most beautiful things I've ever heard a church do, I've always wanted for us to do it here, but we haven't yet. Hopefully one day in the future we will do it, is this church threw a prom for mentally handicapped high school students, those with Down syndrome and disabilities. It was called Night to Shine. Tim Tebow actually is involved helping host this now.
There are a lot of things I'm proud of as your pastor. But I could not be more proud of any group of people in this church than I am our students, because of what they do every Christmas called the Joy Dance. They organize it. They make it happen. Special needs teenagers who would never be asked to a prom are asked to come and dance. Special needs young adults come to this church. Some of them drive up in limos. There's a red carpet. People are dressed up. They line up. They have an escort. They take them inside. They feed them. They dance. They have fun all night long. It is incredible. Why? Because they matter. They are made in the image of God.
Number 5, Paul says our love should brim with the inherent optimism of God's promises.
Here's a 5th directive that Paul gives us, and it's to love optimistically. And here's the last thing, the tangible. This last thing that God told us, this directive through the Apostle Paul. Number 6, he said, love tangibly.
I've always loved the words of the Roman Emperor Julian. They called him Julian the Apostate, one of the worst persecutors of Christianity in church history. This is the only picture I could find of it. He needs to eat more vegetables. His coloring's a little off. But here's what he said. The Christian, he's writing to a friend complaining as to why the church is growing. Look what he says. The Christian cause has been specially advanced through the loving service rendered to strangers. It is a scandal that there is not a single one who's a beggar. Oh, the nerve of those people. Not a single one who's a beggar. This is an enemy talking about the church. And those godless Galileans, that's his pejorative for Christians, they care not only for their own poor, they take care of ours as well. While those who belong to us look in vain for the help that we should be rendering to them.
The Roman Emperor Julian, who was an apostate, he was called Julian the Apostate. What a great title. He said, it is a scandal that there is not a single stranger who is a beggar, and that these godless Galileans, that's what he called Christians, godless Galileans. They only had one God, so they lacked 1,000 other gods. He called us godless. Their godless Galileans care not only for their own poor, but also for ours as well. And while those who belong to us look in vain for the help that we should render them.
Here's a critic of the church talking about why the church is growing. You can't find a needy person near them.
This is a frustrated emperor looking at Christians, and what did he say? The worst he could say about us is that we love people who were not our own.